The name Robert Redford stands out. He's a legend. But legendary careers don't last forever.
They say Robert Redford always knew how to leave a scene. But no one expected this. A handwritten letter, shared quietly, now stirring rumors of a final farewell. Not to Hollywood, but to us. And if you read between the lines, it hurts. The letter that changed everything. What Robert Redford's quiet farewell revealed about the man behind the legend. It did not arrive with fanfare. No press release, no interview, just a letter. Handwritten, deeply personal, and quietly passed between a few trusted friends. There was no announcement, no hint of retirement. But the tone made one thing painfully clear. Robert Redford was saying goodbye in his own way. The letter was never officially published. It surfaced through second-hand accounts and soft leaks from within the Sundance community. But the fragments that reached the public felt too personal to be fake. The voice on the page was unmistakably his, reflective, understated, and unflinchingly honest. One of the first lines said it all. "If this is the last time you hear from me, I want you to know what mattered." That sentence set the tone for everything that followed. It was not an announcement of death. It was not even a declaration of retirement. It was something in between. A private message that drifted into the public like smoke from a long-burning fire. For someone like Redford, silence has always said more than headlines. He never chased celebrity, never begged for the spotlight. Even at the height of his fame, he kept the world at arm's length, choosing the solitude of his Utah ranch over red carpets. So it made sense that, if he were to say goodbye, it would not be loud. It would be this. In the letter, he wrote of time. How it had started to feel slower, heavier. Not sad, just still. He described his mornings in the mountains, the way the light hit the snow, the sound of nothing at all. It read like a man who had made peace with his own silence. There was no mention of illness, no dark foreshadowing, just reflection. A man taking stock of his own legacy before the world did it for him. He spoke, briefly, of regret. Not the usual tabloid fodder, no scandals, no confessions, just quiet truths. Missed time with family, the parts of himself that got lost in the machine of Hollywood. He didn't name names, but he mentioned the people who loved me when I wasn't looking, a phrase that felt directed inward as much as outward. And there was gratitude too, deep, warm, understated. He thanked his fans not for their praise, but for letting me disappear when I needed to. It was one of the few lines that sparked quiet tears in those who read it, because Redford had done just that. Disappeared, little by little, without asking for permission. He didn't use the word retirement, but there was a sense that he was stepping away, not from life, but from the noise around it, from premieres, appearances, the constant echo of fame. True to form, much of the letter returned to nature. He described the land in detail, the rust-colored cliffs of Utah, the smell of pine, the sound of wind moving through dry grass. To him, this was home, not the industry, not the screen, but the wild, unfiltered quiet of the earth. There was a line, brief, almost tossed off, that many people underlined when they saw it. I was always more myself in the trees than in the frame. It was the kind of sentence that needed no explanation. Redford was not saying he was done with life. He was saying he had finally come back to the part of it that mattered most. And that's what made this letter so quietly devastating. Not because it announced anything final, but because it reminded everyone of how rare this kind of grace is. He is still here, still alive. But something about the way he wrote, the way he turned his back gently on the world that once chased him, made people feel the weight of absence anyway. No headlines, no press tour, no awards speech. Just a man, a pen, and a final reminder. If I go quiet, it's because I have nothing left to prove, and nowhere else I'd rather be. The world may not hear from Robert Redford again, but that letter, quiet, unannounced, half lost in the wind, said everything he needed to say. And maybe that was always the plan. The final chapter of A Quiet Legend. Redford never liked goodbyes. He did not give interviews about his last role. He did not stand on stage and wave farewell to his fans. He just started disappearing, slowly, deliberately, one silent choice at a time. By the time The Old Man and the Gun was released in 2018, people began to ask if it might be his last performance. He never confirmed it outright. Instead, he did what he had always done, left room for interpretation. In quiet conversations, he hinted that he was ready to step aside, not just from acting, but from everything that came with being Robert Redford, the icon. It would have been easy for someone with his legacy to orchestrate a grand exit, but that was never his style. There were no tributes, no tell-all books, no dramatic reveals. Just less of him. Fewer red carpets, fewer public appearances, fewer reasons to stay in the spotlight. That is what made the recent letter feel so final. Not because it said anything yet dramatic, but because it confirmed what most people already sensed. He had already been saying goodbye, just without using the word. The Old Man and the Gun was more than a movie. It was a mirror. A story about a man who could not stop running, who smiled even as he slipped away. Redford played Forrest Tucker with that same soft grin, not tired, just finished. For many, it felt like a personal goodbye disguised as fiction. Since then, he has turned down major roles. He stopped directing. His last producer credit came quietly. When asked in passing about retirement, he would give half smiles or quiet deflections. No one pushed. Everyone knew better. But behind the scenes, friends say the shift was clear. He started spending more time at his ranch in Utah. He declined interviews, even ones tied to major anniversaries of his most iconic films. And Sundance, the institute he built from the ground up, began to feel more like a legacy than an active project. The world kept moving, but Redford stood still. Some say it was aging. At 88, even legends have limits. But this was not about physical slowing. This was something else. A conscious decision to detach, to go quiet while there was still time to enjoy the silence. There was no scandal, no falling out. Just a man who had given enough and finally chose to take something back for himself. This is the part that many younger fans miss, because Redford's quiet withdrawal is not new. It is just now becoming visible. Over the years, he has made a habit of stepping out of view. After all is lost, he disappeared for a time. After a river runs through it, he returned to the trees. Each break got a little longer. Each comeback a little more uncertain. Now, it seems there may be no more comebacks. The shift in his storytelling. In his final performances, Redford's characters began to mirror his real life more clearly than ever. There were fewer words, more pauses, less action, more reflection. Whether it was All Is Lost, Truth, or The Old Man and the Gun, he was no longer playing heroes. He was playing men who had lived too long in the world and were now quietly asking to leave it behind. His directing followed the same arc. Less momentum, more stillness. The Company You Keep was about past mistakes, not present action. Lions for Lambs questioned the very machinery he once glorified. There was always integrity in his work, but now there was vulnerability too. And when his voice started to leave the films altogether, that is when people started listening. Because sometimes silence is louder than applause. What makes Redford's near absence so striking is that no one has truly filled the space. Not in film, not in public life. There is no other actor-director quite like him, no one who carried idealism so quietly or made solitude look like strength. His exit has not caused panic, but it has left a kind of ache, as if the industry knows something essential is missing, but cannot say what. And the truth is, maybe he planned it that way, to let people notice the emptiness before they missed the man himself. That is what the letter confirmed, that he had not just gone quiet. He had been choosing this silence for years. He is still alive, still breathing the air of the Utah mountains. But his voice, once part of America's cultural backbone, has grown softer. And that softness, that decision to retreat before being forced out, may be the most Redford thing of all, because he is not gone. Not yet. But he is no longer looking back. The love, loss, and silence he carried. He never spoke much about it. Not on stage, not on camera, but anyone who truly followed Robert Redford's life, not just the films, but the silences in between, knew there were chapters he carried quietly, without press or applause. The death of his firstborn son, Scott, in 1959 was one of them. A sudden illness, a cruel twist, the kind of loss no father ever fully recovers from. Redford was only 22 at the time, still unknown to the world, still finding his footing as a man. That loss came early, but it never left him. And though he never turned it into a headline, it seeped into everything he did after. In the few moments he did speak of it, barely a sentence, sometimes just a nod. There was always restraint, but it was there. You could see it in the roles he chose, the fathers trying to reach their sons, the men keeping pain at bay by running, by working, by retreating into silence. He never played grief loudly, but he understood it in his bones. His first marriage to Lola Van Wagenen lasted almost 3 decades. 4 children, a shared history, a public image that, for a time, looked untouchable. But behind the photos and premieres, things grew distant. Not scandalous, just strained. Friends say Redford was already half living in another world, a world of nature, privacy, introspection. Lola, for her part, had her own path. When they quietly separated in the 1980s, it was without bitterness. But it marked a shift. From that point on, Redford pulled back even further. From public life, from emotional risk, from needing to be known. The divorce was never tabloid fodder. It did not have to be. The distance spoke for itself. Then came Sibylle Zagars, an artist, a woman of vision, movement, and calm. They met in the 1990s and married much later, not out of hesitation, but intention. Redford had learned not to rush. Not with art, not with trust, and certainly not with the heart. With Sibylle, he found companionship that asked nothing from the past. She did not need the Robert Redford the world adored. She cared for the one who got quiet at dinner. The one who disappeared into landscapes, camera in hand. The one who sometimes forgot to answer his phone because the canyon light was too good to miss. They were rarely photographed together, by choice. She traveled with him often, but stayed out of interviews. And when she did speak, it was usually about the earth, her art, or their shared commitment to sustainability. Never the spotlight. For Redford, that was the point. He had built a life too large to carry. With Sibylle, he could finally set it down. Grief that was never for sale. There is no single loss that defined him, but there were many that shaped the way he moved through the world. The quiet death of a child, the quiet end of a marriage, the passing of friends, mentors, and collaborators he never publicly eulogized. Over time, it added up, not to bitterness, but to gravity. His work slowed, his appearances faded. But this was not isolation, it was protection. A soft border between him and a world that had taken too much. Even the letter, the one that spread across inboxes and whispered corners of the film world, carried that same restraint. When he referenced those I miss, he did not name them. But everyone reading felt the weight. It was not performance, it was presence. He was telling us gently that some things had hurt more than he ever let on. At 88, Redford is still alive, still walking his land, still watching the sky change over Utah's red cliffs. But there is a visible shift in his posture. A slowing, yes, but also a stepping back. The kind that only comes after decades of carrying things others never saw. He did not vanish because he was tired of fame. He vanished because fame does not protect you from grief. If anything, it makes it harder. It makes people expect strength, even when you are unraveling. This is the part the world often misses. Robert Redford was not cold. He was protecting something. The quiet, the sacred, the private pieces of a life that no movie ever tried to capture. Today, Sibyl remains close, not just as a wife, but as a buffer. A quiet reminder that not every part of Redford's life belongs to the public. Their shared home in Utah is less a house and more a sanctuary. A place where names are not spoken out loud, but memories are still alive in the way he tends the land, keeps old photos, or sits in silence longer than most people know how to bear. Nature was his only constant. In the late 1960s, when most of his peers were moving to Los Angeles or New York, Redford bought a stretch of wild land in the mountains of Utah. He did not build a mansion. He did not invite a camera crew. He lived among the cottonwoods and canyons and let the place shape him. Not the other way around. It became home. And more than that, it became Sundance. What began as a patch of land turned into one of the most influential platforms for independent film in the world. But even as Sundance grew, Redford's relationship with it stayed grounded in one thing: space. Space for stories. Space for silence. Space for people to create without being watched. When he stepped back from Sundance's leadership years later, it was with the same soft hands he had used to build it. Grateful, not grasping. The land stayed his, but the spotlight? He let that go. Redford was an environmentalist before it became a press release. He lobbied, he donated, he protested. But rarely did he place himself in front of the cause. He never turned activism into performance. Instead, he used his voice to lift the ones being ignored: scientists, tribal leaders, young organizers, and defenders of places most people had never heard of. He knew fame was a megaphone, but he never liked the sound of his own echo. And when he did speak, at Senate hearings, at rallies, in op-eds, it was always tied back to the land. Not just because it was under threat, but because it was personal. To Redford, the earth was never background, it was memory. The way he described the cliffs of Zion. The way he spoke about standing under old trees that had outlived him by centuries. The quiet reverence he carried for places untouched by roads or scripts or expectations. That was the truth of him. That was the man behind the actor. People who read the letter noticed how often he returned to place. Not people, not projects. Place? He described the ridgeline I walked this morning, the color of the grass after a spring thaw, the stillness of standing waist-deep in a stream and not needing anything but the sound of water. It did not sound like retirement. It sounded like arrival, as if this life, the one in the wild, without lines to memorize or hands to shake, was the one he had been trying to get back to all along. He did not call it retreating. He called it returning. And in a quiet line buried near the end, he wrote something that stuck with everyone who saw it. "This is the only place I've never had to explain myself. Redford is still here, still breathing mountain air, still walking paths he has walked for decades. But he is no longer reaching back toward the screen. That part of him feels finished. Not because he is tired, but because he finally has what he spent a lifetime chasing: quiet. And if fans feel heartbroken, it is not because he is gone. It is because he is further away than they expected, not in distance, in focus. The world may never see him on a screen again. But that was never the real Robert Redford anyway. The real man was out there all along, under cottonwoods, by a river, looking out over a valley that never once asked who he used to be. What the world will remember. The industry didn't know what to do with his silence. When Redford began to fade from public life, there was confusion. Not because he owed anyone more work, but because so few people leave like that anymore. On their own terms, without fanfare. Studios tried to lure him back. Awards committees drafted tribute plans. Even journalists who had covered him for decades struggled to pin down a single closing headline. There was nothing scandalous to cling to, no fall from grace, just a man who had said everything he needed to say and then went home. And that unsettled people, because it is easy to process a legend when they go out swinging, when they write memoirs and sit for one last camera. Redford gave none of that. He gave the world decades of art, then withdrew into trees and time and left the rest to interpretation. So the industry filled the silence as best it could, with admiration. Actors who worked with him still speak about his eyes, not in the romantic sense, in the listening sense. How he made you feel seen, how he directed by nod, not command, how even at his most famous, he carried none of the noise that fame demands. Directors remember his patience, the way he held back when others pushed forward, the way he could shape a scene just by doing less. Younger artists, especially those who passed through Sundance, describe him with reverence, not because he handed out praise, but because he made room for them to exist. He believed in space, in slow-building things, in work that did not beg for attention. And many say the same thing now. He just stopped showing up. As if one day he had been in the room, and the next, only his absence remained. But no one speaks of it bitterly. They speak of it like a season that changed, like the sun shifted on the horizon and everyone else just had to adjust. For his fans, the letter hurt most because it did not offer closure. It did not explain everything. It did not tie his life in a neat bow. It left them wondering, is he done for good? Is he sick? Is this really the last we'll hear from him? But maybe that was the gift, not knowing. Redford had always resisted the idea that a person's life could be summed up in a headline or a highlight reel. He built characters who wrestled with contradictions, who longed for solitude even in moments of triumph, who made peace with ambiguity. And now, as he edges out of the world's gaze, that ambiguity remains. There are no goodbye posts on social media, no final curtain calls, just the memory of a voice, a face, a kind of quiet strength that the screen no longer holds. And maybe that is why it still lingers. His legacy was never meant to be claimed. There is no museum exhibit planned, no statue being built. Redford's legacy is not being curated. It is being remembered in fragments. In the films he made, yes, but also in the filmmakers he nurtured, in the causes he championed, in the way he stepped aside without demanding applause. He taught people how to arrive, but more than that, he taught them how to leave. Not by disappearing, but by choosing stillness. Not by announcing an ending, but by letting the silence become the ending. That is what makes this feel different. Most legends are remembered because they asked to be. Redford is remembered because he never did. He is still alive, still walking his land, still in love with the same woman, under the same trees, looking at the same mountains. But to the rest of the world he has become something else entirely. A shadow that warms rather than chills, a memory that breathes. And if this is the last we hear from him, if that letter was, in fact, the softest kind of goodbye, then he leaves the world exactly how he moved through it. Not loudly, but deeply. Not with a legacy carved in stone, but with one that floats, like dust in sunlight, only visible if you stop and really look. He never said he was leaving forever. But after that letter, after all that silence, maybe he does not have to. Maybe this was always the way he wanted to be remembered, quietly, and only by those who were listening.